Excellent. So good morning, everybody, to our Friday morning drop-in. Thanks all for attending. Craig is going to take us through, take us back to basics, how we use what boxes and why boxes, and why the methodology underpinning that is so powerful. So without further ado, Craig, I'm going to pass over to you. I'm going to turn my video off, and we'll look forward to seeing what you've got to share with us. So I'll just remind our participants, if everyone's got a question, please just jump in and ask it. It's a smaller group today, so you can either use the chat box or just go off mute and ask the question. And I might have one or two for you as well, Craig. Okay, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Angus. I'll switch my video off as well because I'll be sharing my screen. This is going to be this is going to be sort of quite focused because pre-pandemic we were doing quite a bit of classroom-based training, and a big chunk of the day, the training day, we would spend really helping people understand the approach and the methodology, and we did that through some explanations, but really drilling people by getting them to run a series of exercises, starting off with something that's very simple, very vague, whether it's making a cup of tea or making toast or going to work in the morning, those sorts of processes, and then building up sort of slightly more complicated, more kind of business relevant processes throughout the day. And we do that because there's lots of different sort of perspectives when you're using this approach, and it's a very simple approach, right? That was always the idea behind it, but it's incredibly powerful. I liken it, I don't know if anyone is familiar with the game called Go, which is played with little black and white stones on a board that's similar to a chessboard but different. And one of the things that is fascinating about Go is that it has a very, very simple set of rules, but it has an infinite number of possibilities in how the game plays out. In fact, from that perspective, it's much more complex than chess. And it took many more years for scientists to develop a computer that was powerful enough to beat a human at Go. In fact, I think they only achieved it in recent years. And I always think that's very similar to the approach that we use in SCORE. In that it's a very simple set of rules, but the possibilities are limitless. So I've got a process open here. It's one that I use a lot for demonstrating, which is capturing expenses. I'm just going to do a kind of use this as the sort of background for the approach for what I'm going to show you. The other thing is we do, and I'll quickly talk through this. We talk about on the training the 5-step approach to how we use this methodology, and that is the first step is you want to define your title and scope. The second is you capture activities. Then you start to think about the outputs, or the Y boxes, excuse my spelling. Then we'd look at roles, so who does it? And then the 5th step is, what other information do you need to capture against that process? And one of the reasons that we do it this way is, well, there's a few reasons, but but essentially what happens, you set the title and scope, which sets your boundaries, right? It's what is the process we're mapping, where does it start and where does it finish? Then we go into capturing activities because, and I'm sure others are finding it as frustrating as me that I've spelt activities wrong, but I'm not going to dwell on it. We go into we focus on activities because when you're getting people to think about a process, it's easy for people to think about what they do, but it's quite difficult for them to think about why they do it or what the outputs or deliverables are from those activities. So we always start with, like, let's just chuck the activities up onto the screen. Then we'll do the outputs afterwards. And what you start to see is you basically iterate through the process with the team each time. Then you go back through the process again and do roles. And every time you do that, people will go, oh, actually, it doesn't quite work like that. It works like this. And so it's a really nice, simple, neat way to map out a process. And if you follow those 5 steps, especially if you're new to this, you cannot go wrong. Like, literally, makes it so easy. As you become more experienced, of course, what you find is then, as long as you've got your title and scope, you can sort of capture some activities, maybe do some outputs roles, but only if you're comfortable that you can always bring people back to iterate through the process again. So that's a little bit of background into terms of how we use the approach. So you'll have been familiar with the what box and the why box, and before I go into explaining the kind of usage of them, just a little bit of background into where this came from. So the modeling approach that underpins this is something called IDEF0, which was developed in conjunction with the US Air Force, I think in the early 1980s, and it's a systems modeling approach, and it was developed in order to help them start to understand that the complex relationships that were starting to, that they were having to deal with in fighter aircraft, where you've got, at the time, increasingly more complicated computer systems. You've got complicated navigation systems, obviously, in a fighter aircraft, and the human. And it's like, how do all those systems sort of start to fit together? The approach has been somewhat simplified, but it is systems based. And if you know anything about, if you've looked at systems, the idea is you've got a sort of black box, you've got inputs and outputs, which and that black box, you may or may not be able to break it down depending on how complicated or complex it is inside it. So that's a little bit about the background of where it came from. We developed it further at a company called Nimbus Partners, which was later acquired by TIBCO, and they call it UPN, or Universal Process Notation. What we wanted to do with SCORE was looking at how do we make it kind of more obvious to people looking at the process. So hence we embedded the questions, but we struggled a little bit with the why, asking why. Because you're not always really asking why you do the activity. You're trying to understand what the value or the transformation that happens in the activity, what's it delivering. And we actually looked at something called user stories, which is common in agile software development, and of much more commonly used today in all sorts of project and program management. But the idea is you use it as a simple phrase: I am a person, I do this thing so that I get some sort of value out of it. And that's really where the questions come from. So the what box itself, as I said, it's about describing activities, what happens. So we always describe the activity. I say we highly recommend that you describe the activities using a verb and noun construct. So you're doing something to something. So I'm going to, in my expenses example here, I'm going to say scan receipts might be one of the steps that I'm doing as part of that process. So again, I could put up, there might be other parts of the process here. It could be, I don't know, send for approval, and then somebody might actually be, approve expenses. It could be lots of other things in there. So I'll get my main activities ideally up on the screen, and then go back and start looking at the why boxes. And one of the things that I think a trap that people often fall into, and this is why we try to spend quite a bit of time on this in the training, is that if you're the person capturing the process or mapping it, there's a good chance you're not the doer of the process. Sometimes you are, right? Sometimes you're sitting there mapping your own processes. But often you're mapping someone else's processes. So it's not up to you necessarily to figure out what goes in the why box. It's a tool that you can use to interrogate the team to understand or help them understand their processes better. And why or so that are just two of the possible questions you could be asking here. So I again, in the training, I think we have in the training presentation, there's a list of questions that we suggest that you might be asking. It's like, okay, what value does this doing this work, what value is it bringing to the company, to the process, or to your customer? Or is there something tangible or measurable that results in doing this piece of work? So those are the sorts of things you're asking. It's like, how do I know that how do I know that piece of work is finished, or how do I know I'm then ready to do the next piece of work? And I find, certainly in a workshop type environment, this is probably one of the most powerful tools in the SCORE toolbox, because it's where everyone really starts to open up and go, do you know what? I don't really know why we do that. We do it because, well, Angus taught me how to do this, and that's the way he told me to do it. And it's at that point where people start to question, and it's really interesting, because if you're following the 5-step approach up here, and you throw out the activities, one of my favorite examples was from working with a government agency years ago, and one of the boxes was produce weekly reports. One of the activities, nobody questioned, nobody raised an eyebrow that putting that activity in the process. But when we came to look at the output, or the Y box for that activity, the person who called it out was like, oh, well, I just kind of print it out and stick it in that drawer over there. and it was at that point when people started to kind of look at each other, and I asked the room, does anyone look at this report? And it was a classic case where this person had taken over the role for somebody who was going on maternity leave. They'd show them every Friday morning, I get all these reports, I generate this one master report, print it out and stick it in the filing cabinet. And this person was a little bit embarrassed about it, but everyone was kind of like, hey, no, none of us picked this up before. So it's that power of just generating those conversations, really, that is the most useful part of using the Y box. And it's contextual as well, so often it will depend on the process you're mapping what it would make a good output to put in this box. Now, the way I again try to guide people in the training around this is to think about, okay, if you're mapping the process on behalf of someone else, so you're facilitating a workshop, it's ultimately up to the group to agree what they think is the right thing. So you might not necessarily agree it's a good output, but if as long as it follows some basic rules and everyone understands it, then put it in. So the simple rules really are, it's not an activity, it's an output. So it's some sort of state or thing that exists ideally. So don't use a verb and a noun. In this case, again, there's lots of things I could put in here, but what I'd probably put in here is I've got receipts stored in a digital format. Now, when I'm mapping, of course, there's nothing wrong with suggesting to the team, is it this? Is that what it is? You've got the receipt stored in a digital format. Sometimes people want to be more specific. It's stored in a digital format on my hard drive, which means then the next box actually in there is, upload receipts. And then it can go on for sending for approval and approving them. And that again is one of those valuable conversations you have in those workshops, where someone goes, well, couldn't we have a system where I could just have an app on my phone, take a photo of the receipt, and it automatically stores it and uploads it for me? Time saving or improvement opportunity. So that's a sort of conversation you can really generate with using the Y boxes. And as I was saying, the most simple rule is it's not a verb and a noun. That's the thing you really need to be to avoid, because if you go back to the activity, verb and noun, it's not a verb and noun. It's a very, very simple rule, but if you apply it across all the processes, it just makes the processes so much easier to read for anyone who comes at it, comes new to it. So,
Craig, can I just ask you a question now?
yeah.
And also just to encourage any other questions anyone might have. When you do you put up the what boxes there, and then you start doing the Y boxes. Do you typically complete, say, doing the what boxes and then come back and do the Y boxes, or is there a sort of combination depending on the circumstances?
So if you follow the 5-step approach, which I highly recommend, especially if you're new to this, is I would always obviously put a title at the top of the page. I would always start using a Y box at the beginning and end, which I didn't really do in this example, and just have a short conversation about what is the start point, what's the initial trigger to trigger the process, and how do we know when the process is finished. Doesn't have to be perfect, because when you map the process you might find that it changes anyway. But then I would then throw up like a bunch of empty watt boxes and really just work on the activities. Don't worry too much about the outputs. Now, I mean, you'll know from experience, Angus, that often someone will describe an activity and they'll describe the output at the same time. In which case, if someone said it, capture it. Like there's no harm. But the recommendation is stick to the activities first, because people find it easy, first of all, to describe what they do. They'll find it hard to describe why they do it. You get them to talk about what they do, and you get the nice flow, you get the conversation going, people get, you know, enthusiastic, it becomes more interactive, and then you kind of slow them down a bit with the why boxes. But by that time they're in the flow and they're like, okay, no, I can see why we need to understand, or why we need to challenge what we do.
Okay, thanks.
I mean, I've really only got one in this particular topic. There's only one other thing that I would talk about here, which in terms of the Y boxes or outputs, is to think about I said it's not a verb and noun, right? It's not an activity, the output. But there is a sort of some of my colleagues might be a bit more stronger about this than I am, but there is also it's not really a rule, but a suggestion that you try to avoid just using the past tense of the previous activity. So in this case, like I might have an output which is, you know, receipts scanned. Okay, I would also suggest strongly suggest avoid that, because it's not adding any value, right? You know that the receipts would be scanned if that activity has been finished. It's a bit of a cop-out, because you could then just write that into every box. It's not telling you anything new. Yeah, go back to what I said, the Y box is a powerful tool to help you generate discussions with people about how the process really works. So if you choose not to use it, that's fine, but you're losing a huge amount of value. And so that's why I say, try to avoid the past tense. Sometimes you just can't think of anything else, and the conversation runs its course, and actually you just come back to that. In which case, don't dwell on it, just stick it in, or leave it blank. Sometimes if no one knows what value an activity delivers, leave it blank. The question's still visible. It tells you something about the process. So it's a bit of a tip in terms of using it.
Yeah. Thanks
and
very much. Yeah.
And I was just going to say the last thing is the who does it. Yeah, we tend to use roles, it's rather than people's names in there. But yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, no, thanks, Craig. That's really great. And I think, I mean, as you can see, the temptation is to address more and more topics, but it's great just to sort of keep it focused on today on the what and the why. And I certainly found your earlier explanation, going back over the sort of genesis of that, really powerful reminder of why the methodology is as it is. So can I just open it up to any of the participants who'd like to ask any questions? And Norma Jean, good to see you've joined us. I hope you're doing well.
Thanks, Angus. How's everyone?
Hi, Norma.
I have a question, actually.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Craig. That's like very clear. But are there ever any instances where you find that actually it's not very useful to have the white box in between two Y box instead in between two white boxes? Do you ever have that?
Yeah, so that tends to happen when you're in a very low level of detail in the process, right? You know, you're really down sometimes in the button clicking steps in the process. You know, click here, do that, because you know the value being delivered is the value of completing all of the steps. Yeah, which is like, you know, I click here, download this form, fill out this piece. So there are times that's really the only one I ever come across. And funnily enough, some of the companies, the RPA, the robotic process automation companies that we work with, where they're using SCORE to map the high level process to understand the context, but they are going down to that click level. What some of them do, I've seen, is that actually they don't even do it as a process flow, right? They just put the what boxes as a kind of list on the page, and then sometimes a screenshots next to them.
Oh, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Any other questions, Miriam?
No, I think that's really clear and was really helpful. I think you call it the wire box, so that helps me understand how to use it best, because I've used this a few times, but I'm still learning. So it's
Okay,
good
yeah.
to have that fundamental understanding of how to use it in a way that's really beneficial for us.
Something else that just sort of came to mind that comes up often in the training when we're doing this is, and actually Norma Jean's question would fit perfectly with this, is when you're describing activities, people sometimes get a bit caught out with how detailed those steps should be that you're capturing in the process. Yeah, because bearing in mind that we have this ability to create detailed views, right? So I can go and create a detailed view, zoom down into my scan receipts box. Again, in the training, what I'd say to people, we actually do a workshop exercise, and one of the things we talk about this topic, and what you'll often find when you're with a diverse group of people is you will have some people who naturally think at quite a high strategic level. So they'll describe a big complex process in 4 or 5 steps, whereas the next person in the room will actually be thinking about it in terms of, right, I literally keystroke, I log into my computer, I open this app, I open this screen in the app, I then click on this button in the app, and when that happens, actually the best thing to do is just chuck it all onto the page, right? And if you actually end up with 30 or 40 boxes on the page, that's all right, because you'll very quickly through the conversation, people will quickly start to go, do you know what, those 5 boxes there, they're really just a subset of something else, and those ones over there, actually we could describe that in with 1 box, and so let's push them down. And when that happens, you literally create your detailed view, you select your boxes, you do a Control C to copy them, and you drill down and paste them into the level below. Now, did I actually copy them? But yeah, you would basically copy and paste them down into the level below. And that in itself, again, is a very powerful exercise for the group to go through, because it's really getting them, again, to think about their process, and are things happening in the order that they should be happening. And I always find it fascinating, because that's often where people start saying, wouldn't it be great if, it'd be good if we had something that did this. So this whole framework and methodology and approach, what you find when you're in a workshop is the team actually start to sort of self-analyze the process, and they identify a lot of the issues, and they tell you what the opportunities for improving it is. And it takes away a huge amount of that work that you traditionally have done, have gone away, and then analyze the process afterwards and come back with ideas.
Yeah, that's really useful. Thank you.
Yeah, it resonates actually, Craig, because there's always a moment in a workshop, especially when there's a number of you and you're doing the mapping, when you kind of look at a blank canvas with 3 or 4 boxes on it, maybe a bit like this, and there's a sort of clunking feeling where you're like, goodness me, I can't see us getting through this. And then suddenly something happens which sort of unleashes the creativity.
Yeah, well, I think Colin is, I don't know if he's still on the call, he uses this phrase workshop 0. So often when you're working with a new group of people around the process, that first workshop can be sometimes feel quite painful, and you can sit there for sort of 40 minutes and you've only got 1 box on the page. And what's actually happening in that situation is there's a lot of group dynamics going on, and people are just sort of trying to suss each other out. They're kind of trying to understand the approach. They're trying to work out what's really being asked of them, like what's behind all these questions about our work. And at some point in that first sort of 30 or 40 minutes, it just clicks into place, and you suddenly then spend 5 minutes and you map the rest of it, and it's people go, oh, okay, I get it, it's like this.
Good stuff. Excellent. Look, Craig and everyone, thank you very, very much for that. That was really useful. I will share the recording on the community for anyone who'd like to have a recap. But again, thank you all very much, and look forward to seeing you all next Friday for those that can attend.
Thank you.